Good afternoon, everyone. As Pro-Vice-Chancellor and President of Reuben College, I'm delighted to welcome you all to the 2025 Cyril Foster Lecture. Now, you may well ask who Cyril Foster was. Well, in fact, we know very little about him. He owned several sweet shops in and around London and lived on his own, in a caravan, in fact, in Essex. But when he died, he left a bequest to the University of Oxford, asking for an annual lecture to be delivered on the topic of elimination of war and a better understanding of the nations of the world. Quite an unusual wish, especially as Mr. Foster had no previous connection with the University of Oxford. So over the past 60 years, since 1960 in fact, the Cyril Foster Lecture Series has brought some of the world's most influential policymakers and academics to Oxford to deliver the annual lecture. Previous speakers have included prime ministers and foreign ministers, secretary generals of the United Nations, and heads of major international organizations, as well as prominent academics. Now, the topic of today's lecture, as you all know, is how to end wars, pragmatic approaches to peace building. As someone whose paternal grandfather was born in Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine, I find this topic particularly interesting. The new American administration has already discovered, after more than 100 days, that it is easier to conclude trade deals. I'm sure you've all seen the news of the US-UK deal. The press conference is still going on as we start this lecture. It's easier to conclude trade deals than to end wars. We are privileged to have here today, on this very auspicious day, as we also celebrate the 80th anniversary of Victory in Europe, VE Day, 8th of May 1945, we're privileged to have two leading internationally renowned speakers on peace activism and peacekeeping, who will give today's Cyril Foster Lecture, the 2025 lecture, Christine Ahn and Lieutenant General Dan Leaf, who served with the US Air Force. I am very much looking forward to hearing their thoughts on a global topic based on their considerable experience in the Asia-Pacific region. So I'm very pleased now to hand over to Professor Neta Crawford, the Montague Burton Chair in International Relations and a Professorial Fellow of Balliol College, who will introduce our two speakers.
Well, it is fitting that we're holding this lecture on the 8th of May. As we've already heard, today marks the end of the war in Europe. And of course, when World War II ended, in the Pacific in August 1945, something similar happened, a place that's very far away from here. People at the end of wars can start something. They can enter a beginning. They can begin a physical, a spiritual recovery. They can rebuild. They can engage in family reunion. However, when wars don't end, when conflict persists, none of that is possible. Societies remain mobilized, distrust persists, and trauma lives in the bodies of the participants and their descendants. So there are several persistent conflicts that we could talk about, including India and Pakistan exchanging bullets today, bombs, Israel and its neighbors. And the Korean War is one of those persistent conflicts where people have not been allowed to engage in the rebuilding and the reunion and the recovery. So it has also drawn China and the US, both historically and today, into that conflict. Now, there's a couple of kinds of diplomacy. One is track one diplomacy, which occurs between leaders and governments. And then there's track two diplomacy, where track two diplomacy develops relationships of trust between the parties. It increases knowledge about the other side. And Track 2 diplomacy is undertaken by not the heads of government, but by individuals operating as part of non-governmental organizations or in a retired capacity, in an unofficial capacity. And what happens there with Track 2 diplomacy may also be related to civilian diplomacy. And this is the work of peacebuilding that we're going to hear about from two experts. So the Track 2 diplomats, if you want to call them that, are Lieutenant General Dan Leaf, who was born in Wisconsin, not too long before and not too far away from where I was born. He was commissioned in the United States Air Force, and he became a pilot during the Cold War. He's flown combat missions in the Middle East and Europe. He was in leadership roles in the military, including as Vice Commander of the Air Force Space Command before it became an independent command, and then Deputy Commander of Pacific Command. He's wearing a couple of his medals, including the Bronze Star and his Distinguished Service Medals. You'll see them when he gets up here. He also participated in some of the first meetings, in fact, the first meeting between members of the military of Vietnam and the US. So he's both a Track 1 and a Track 2 diplomat. Christine Ahn was born in South Korea. I don't know the town, though. Maybe Seoul, in Seoul, South Korea. She has a master's degree in international policy from Georgetown University. Now, she's very well known for her work in an organization which she founded and co-directed for many years, Women Cross the DMZ. She's been working on ending the war between North and South Korea for, I think, all of her adult life. And in 2015, she led 30 well-known women peacekeepers and 10,000 other people in an exercise to cross the demilitarized zone. Something that had never happened before in such a way. So she is the founder, as I said, of Women Cross DMZ and the Feminist Peace Initiative. And late last year, the South Korean government, which has its own problems with democracy, banned her from entering the country to give a keynote address at the International Youth Peace Forum in November. So in 2022, finally, the Peace Summit of Nobel Peace Laureates gave her a Peace Summit Medal for social activism. So I bring you first Christine Ahn.
Thank you, Neta. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you for this opportunity to deliver the annual Cyril Foster Lecture. It's a great honor to be here with Neta, Dan, and the Oxford community. And I congratulate your City Council for recently passing a motion supporting the BDS movement to stop the genocide of Palestinians. For over 2 decades, I have worked to end one of the longest and oldest wars, the 75-year-old Korean War, which many people don't realize it never ended. What my experience has shown is that people-to-people engagement, particularly the involvement of civil society and women, is crucial to building and sustaining peace. A decade ago, on the 70th anniversary of Korea's division, I organized a delegation of 30 women peacemakers to cross the demilitarized zone from North Korea to South Korea to draw global attention to this unresolved war. We walked with thousands of Korean women on both sides of the DMZ. We held peace symposiums in Pyongyang and in Seoul, where Korean women shared how their lives have been impacted by war. And international women, in turn, shared how they helped end wars in their countries, including in Liberia, Northern Ireland, and Colombia. Although many accused us as being naive or apologists, We did what we felt was necessary to end conflict, meeting face-to-face, people to people, who are told they are our enemies. While this powerful action succeeded in bringing global attention to this so-called forgotten war, I wondered, how will we actually end the longest-standing U.S. conflict? How do you challenge the military-industrial complex that profits from endless war? As individuals, we can feel powerless against the larger forces at play, but we kept bringing women together, and at crucial times. That's because a 2015 global study by the International Peace Institute, spanning 3 decades of 40 peace processes, found that of the 182 signed peace accords, an agreement was signed in all but one case when women's groups and civil society influenced the peace process. A 2020 Georgetown University study also found that women's groups help legitimize the formal peace process among the public. So that's what we set out to do. In 2016, after North Korea conducted a nuclear test, we brought 6 North Korean women to Indonesia. Many of these women had never left their country. In 2017, when the US and North Korea seemed to be on the precipice of war, we convened 20 women in Vancouver to urge foreign ministers to pursue peace. We organized a letter from hundreds of women from 40 nations, including North Korea, to urge President Trump to diffuse military tensions and start negotiating for peace to prevent nuclear war. That, in fact, made it to the New York Times. And I know that he read that letter. In 2018, after the Panmunjom summit between Kim and Moon, we brought 25 women to Seoul to support the Korea peace process and to urge President Trump to meet Kim Jong-un. That year, we also convened the first ever Northeast Asia Women Peace and Security Roundtable in Beijing with women from North and South Korea, Japan, China, Russia, the US, and Canada. I can't help but think how impossible that would be to do today. In 2019, after all those convenings, we launched the Korea Peace Now campaign with the Nobel Women's Initiative, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and the Korean Women's Movement for Peace. We then built the Korea Peace Now grassroots network in the US of multi-generational Korean Americans, including members of divided families, peace activists, veterans, faith-based leaders, humanitarian aid workers who had been on the ground in North Korea, academics and students. This movement helped pave the way for the first ever congressional resolution calling for an end to the Korean War. Today, the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act has bipartisan support. But this work has its ups and downs. In 2017, it seemed North Korea and the US were on the brink of war. You may recall the fire and fury and totally destroy North Korea. In 2019, then, when Trump met Kim in Hanoi, it felt like we were on the cusp of peace. So where are we today? I see 3 obstacles and 3 opportunities to finally achieve peace. Number 1, the first obstacle is that most people don't even know that the Korean War never officially ended. The Korean War was only halted in 1953 when military commanders from the US, North Korea, and China signed an armistice. The Korean War was a civil war, and it was also the front line of the Cold War. It involved 21 nations, including the UK, which I believe sent the 3rd largest number of troops to fight in that war. From 1950 to 53, some 4 million people were killed, 80% of North Korean cities obliterated, and more bombs were dropped, 635,000 tons, than in all of the Asia-Pacific theater in World War II. The US splattered 32,000 tons of napalm, which Winston Churchill said was, quote, very cruel and amounted to torture. The US's air bombing campaign was so massive and so destructive that just 1 year into the war, U.S. Major General Emmett O'Donnell testified to the Senate, quote, "There are no more targets in Korea," end quote. The Korean War is the singular trauma for Koreans, but to Americans, it's called the Forgotten War, partly because President Truman called it a police action and never got congressional authorization. The trauma really began when Korea was colonized by Japan in 1910. And when World War II ended, President Truman, fearing the spread of communism, divided this ancient country. Instead of liberation, which included my parents, who were living in that time, Koreans got divided just by the single stroke of an American pen drawn across the 30th parallel from a map torn from the National Geographic by 2 defense officers. Truman then sent a memo to Stalin, giving Soviets north of the 38th parallel and Americans south of it and Seoul. Not a single Korean was consulted. It's important to know this history because it helps us focus on the key party that must sign a peace agreement with North Korea, and that is the US, which has played a heavy hand on the peninsula from installing into power Koreans who collaborated with their Japanese colonizers. They've played a heavy hand on the Korean peninsula. They've installed power Koreans that collaborated with the Japanese during the colonial period. They've backed authoritarian strongmen in South Korea that have quashed democracy. The US still has wartime operational control over South Korea's military, which is among the world's most powerful military forces. And it was the US that actually introduced nuclear weapons to the Korean peninsula. The US has also undermined inter-Korean agreements. For example, after the 2018 Panmunjom summits, you may recall seeing the leaders of North Korea when they met at the DMZ, when they declared a new era of peace for the peninsula. The Trump administration blocked efforts to link the Inter-Korean Railroad, alleging that it violated UN Security Council sanctions. And when President Moon, the last liberal president, appealed to President Biden for an end-of-war declaration, he was shunned. If we are to end war, we must first understand the obstacles that have prevented peace throughout history. A second major obstacle to ending the war is that the Korean Peninsula is what South Korean scholar Pak Nak-jong calls the division system, in which all states with stakes in the region, including China, Japan, Russia, and the US, have a vested interest in maintaining division. The 2 Koreas are entrenched now in a new Cold War between the US, China, and Russia. South Korea is home to the largest overseas US military base, Camp Humphreys, as well as to a US missile defense system, THAAD, because of its proximity to China. Biden enlisted South Korea and Japan, you may recall, in the last administration, in a trilateral military alliance to counter China and to send arms to Ukraine. And North Korea sent arms and troops to fight alongside Russia in Ukraine. A third major obstacle that I see is the dominant view of deterrence as the path to securing peace. The problem with this logic is that deterrence, maintaining massive military power to intimidate other countries from attacking, is not synonymous with peace. Every spring and fall, the US and South Korea hold joint military exercises. It involves deploying B-2 bombers, nuclear-powered aircraft carriers and submarines, and preemptive strikes simulating decapitation measures against the North Korean regime. The US says these are for readiness, but North Koreans view them as rehearsals for war. And not surprisingly, studies show that these war drills create a more threatening security environment and elicit greater provocation from Pyongyang. But there are opportunities for a new approach. First, most Americans support cutting spending on the military and reinvesting the money in jobs, healthcare, and other programs that actually improve Americans' lives. And according to a new poll last month, the Harris poll, 70% of Americans say that President Trump should meet Kim Jong-un, and 66% says the US should engage China to reduce tensions. A second opportunity, and I understand this will be controversial to many in the room, I believe that President Trump is willing to engage with adversaries, and he is bucking the bipartisan consensus that such engagement is appeasement. Trump has said he has a responsibility to try to achieve peace and denuclearization, that, quote, "It's certainly something that I hope I can do for the world," end quote. By negotiating a peace agreement, President Trump can prevent nuclear war. He can help reunite separated families, and he can help advance human rights and invest in a future that makes the US, Korea, and the whole world safer. His Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, testified, quote, "The US should aim to reduce tensions, prevent conflict, and foster conditions for long-term resolution to the security challenges posed by North Korea." This signals a positive shift. It's important to remember that engagement has led to tangible outcomes. After the Singapore Declaration in 2018, in which the US and DPRK committed to establish new relations towards peace and prosperity, North Korea released detained Americans, repatriated US service member remains, and they imposed a self-imposed moratorium on nuclear and long-range missile testing, and that lasted for 5 years. Although we can expect opposition to Trump's diplomatic overtures, this time there is a coordinated peace movement and peace champions in Congress. Representative Ro Khanna from California, who drafted the first Korea peace bill, says, quote, "We should not oppose efforts to reduce military spending and work towards peace and justice just because it's proposed by Trump," end quote. But to succeed, President Trump will have to abandon his maximum pressure campaign, reverse his travel on Americans going to North Korea, and support inter-Korean reconciliation and cooperation. Maintaining the prevailing US strategy, seeking North Korea's complete, irreversible, and verifiable denuclearization through isolation, pressure, and sanctions is just a recipe for failure. While it's unclear whether Kim will engage, progress on US-Russia relations has created an opening. Alexander Matsugora, the Russian ambassador to North Korea, recently said that, quote, "Pyongyang welcomed the prospect of the US and Russia reviving negotiations," end quote. If the Russia-Ukraine war can be resolved, North Korean soldiers can return home. The two Koreas can stop shipping arms to Russia and Ukraine, and the Trump administration will have more capacity to turn to North Korea. And lastly, South Korea will likely elect a liberal, pro-engagement president. Thanks, Neta, for noting that I am still banned from South Korea, and I'm really grateful to the democracy movement. Thanks to this resilient democracy movement, the South Korean people ousted President Yoon, who you may know attempted to impose martial law last December. And recently, a conservative Supreme Court unanimously backed his impeachment 8-0, and a new president will be elected on June 3rd. The leading candidate is Lee Jae-myung. He's a liberal who has backed engagement with Pyongyang and urged Korea's independence from foreign powers. Lee must balance relations with the North, Trump's tariffs, and South Korea's relationship with Beijing, its major trading partner. I believe that Lee should pursue peace with North Korea for 2 reasons. One, if tensions worsen, South Korea will be even more beholden to Trump, who will extract more concessions over tariffs and force cost sharing for US troops, which there are still 28,500 in South Korea. And 2, as inter-Korean tensions worsened under Yoon's hawkish policies, 70% of South Koreans now want the country to have its own nuclear arsenal. By taking a principled stand for peace and pursuing a policy of mutual respect for sovereignty and peaceful coexistence, I believe that Lee can steer the country in a new direction, redirecting funds for war towards improving the Korean people's lives. Trump himself has called for suspending the US-South Korea war drills as a key step towards building peace. And hopefully with this next South Korean president, the two countries will cancel the August war drills. I believe that that will elicit a positive response from Pyongyang. In closing, we must prevent a global nuclear war that will instantly kill hundreds of thousands of people and impact millions for generations to come. If we don't pursue peace, we are undeniably on a path towards self-destruction. It's time for Americans and the international community to engage in peace building and resume humanitarian aid and cultural exchanges, whether it's the New York Philharmonic performing a concert in Pyongyang, Dennis Rodman engaging in basketball diplomacy, or even another women's DMZ crossing. The Korean Peninsula, imagine, can be transformed from the site of the new Cold War to the foundation of regional and global peace. But unless we meet face to face with our adversaries, learn from each other, and build trust, there will be no durable and lasting peace. And it will take all of us to help settle this war. I'd like to end with a short clip from the Women's Peace Symposium that I talked about in Pyongyang, from the documentary film Crossings by Deanne Borche-Lim. Thank you.
여러분들이 이제 우리나라 방문을 다시 한번 열렬히 환영합니다. 이제 허상리에를 기피하고 우리 조선 여성들과의 감정적 유대를 이어가는데 좋은 기회로 되기를 바랍니다.
Members of this international delegation are here because we want to communicate, we want more dialogue, we want to learn from you, and also to share our experiences.
전쟁할 때 저는 황해남도 재령군 재령읍에서 살았습니다. 어느 날인가 미군 폭격기가 달려들어서 폭탄을 미친 듯이 쏟아붓는 바람에 우리 마을은 말 그대로 피바다 불바다가 되고 저의 아버지와 삼촌, 오빠가 당원이고 무턱대고 끌어다가 때리면서 악착하게 고문하다 못해 끝내는 동두구에 세워놓고선 총으로 쏴 죽였습니다.
What struck me was how much unresolved emotion they still carry.
어머니들과 아이들을 데리고 몰래 마을을 빠져서
I think it was difficult for them to express what they had to share, not knowing how we would receive what they were sharing.
전쟁 시기에 이 두 손을 모두 잃게 되었습니다. 지금 저희 나이는 72살이 되었습니다. 그러니 그때는 제가 7살이었습니다. 미군은 저희 고향 땅에도 기어들어서 저희 마을을 모조리 불사르고 닥친 대로 사람들을 붙잡아갔습니다. 특히 저희 아버지를 붙잡아가고 우리 온 가족을 모두 밖으로 내쫓고 우리 집에는 문마다 못을 박았습니다. 3일째 되는 날 정말 배가 고프고 참을 수가 없어서 제가 바로 마을을 향해서 저희 집을 찾아 들어가게 되었습니다. 그런데 제가 정신없이 집으로 들어가는데 미군 2명이 저를 정신없이 따라 들어오고 있었습니다. 제가 문을 열려고 하는 저희 오른손에 꺼리낌 없이 3m도 되지 않는 우리 집 마당에서 총을 쐈습니다. 그때 놈들이 정말은 저희 작은 오른손목을 사정없이 뚫고 나갔습니다. 정신없이 다시 왼손을 들어서 문고리를 떠잡았는데 이놈들은 다시 저희 오른손에도 왼쪽 손에도 또 총을 쐈습니다. 제가 정신 잃고 땅에 쓰러졌댔는데 이것은 정말 죽음보다도 더 무서운 것이었습니다. 저는 오늘 여성들이 모인 이 자리에서 정의의 양심 앞에 허소합니다. 가장 고통과 가슴 아플 것은 우리 어머니들과 아이들이라고 하게 저는 이 세상의 전쟁을 막고 감사합니다.
All I could think about was how real and alive it was for them, and how not real and alive that war is for Americans. I've made films about women in wartime, and I've heard that story and that story and that story in every country we've worked in. It confirms what I know, which is no matter where they are, no matter what the conflict, a woman's experience of war is the same.
저기하고
연결해.
Greetings, and as we say in Hawaii, aloha. Ordinarily in Hawaii, there'd be a resounding return aloha, but I won't ask for that because what we just saw is a difficult act for me to follow and a difficult thing for us to swallow. Neta, thank you so much for your invitation to be here in this amazing institution. My partner in peace, Christine, we're the odd couple. We could have a debate as well as a mutually supportive discussion. We don't agree on everything, but that's perhaps the beauty of it. And I thank you for getting me exposure and access that I never would have had without our collaboration. So thank you very much, Christine. I'm going to narrow it down to two things, one obstacle and one opportunity. From my perspective, the obstacle is self-image, not individual, but collective. I'll get to that through my self-image. I'm a warrior, okay? That's why I wore this. I don't wear this on my golf shirt or anything else, because those are my roots. And for much of my life, I was a fighter pilot and a warrior, and I did see combat in the air and on the ground. That's not something I shied away from then or now. I was always looking for a fight and wanted to be in the midst of it. And my friend Dave Lewins, who I flew F-15s with when he was an RAF exchange officer, knows that quite well. But he also knows that there's another side of it, because while we celebrate the 80th anniversary of the end of war in Europe, 31 years or so ago, on Battle of Britain Day, Dave flew in a training flight against our Luftwaffe exchange officer in the same squadron in their F-15s. And that's the way wars should end, right? With full reconciliation. And as Christine so clearly said, we are not there yet on Korea by any means. So I was a warrior, but now I consider myself a peacemaker. How did that happen? The exposure of my service certainly was part of it. And I'll give you an example of how committed I was to my job and the psyche that I know those of us who are warriors bring to it. In September of 1983, I was at Misawa Air Base, Japan. We'd just flown up to northern Japan after the Soviet Union shot down a Korean airliner, killing over 200 people, and including a US congressman. And I was the first flight leader on alert. Me and my wingman had fully armed F-15s, and we were ready for the Soviets to make any misstep. We were going to go kick their butts. And our rules of engagement were very liberal. I thought I was on the cutting edge, the very start of World War III. And you know what? There was nowhere else I would have rather been, because that's what I trained to do. Then I went through most of the remainder of my career without seeing combat, and I felt cheated. I didn't participate in Desert Storm, I missed the other conflicts, and this warrior was left out until I was 25 years into my career, and then flew combat missions in the NATO war against Milosevic, preventing ethnic cleansing or ending ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. So I participated directly in combat. And then again in 2003 in Iraq as the senior Air Force representative with the land forces during the invasion. And I did my share of killing, and I say that because we have to understand that is what war is about. What they talk about from a North Korea perspective is what war is about, and we ought not shy away from that discussion. So this combat experience didn't leave me distraught, it left me angry. Not that they happened, we can argue the eaches of those conflicts, and I was in the Pentagon on September 11th, 2001, so I've seen many sides of conflict. It left me angry that kinetic solutions are so easily the choice these days. That we're so quick to think that tritonyl and steel will solve a problem, because generally it won't. And when that's the worst or the best of many bad choices, it should be exactly that, and not the default position. And there is no greater exemplar than the unending Korean War. So that gnawed at me through the remainder of my service. And as the deputy commander at Pacific Command, I used to get frustrated. I'm using much more polite language than Dave Lewins has ever heard me use to describe things like this. When politicians and congressional delegates from both sides of the aisle in the US would come to our headquarters to get a briefing on the dangerous standoff on the Korean Peninsula and react with, well, that's okay, we're not shooting right now attitude. It is not okay. It will never be okay until we solve this problem. And in 2007, in August, as a deputy commander, there was massive flooding in South Korea, and I proposed a humanitarian assistance airdrop of food to these isolated people in the southeastern one-third of North Korea. Kind of out of the blue idea. My boss, the 4-star, liked it. I called the Secretary of Defense. He liked it. We could have done it easily. We'd done it before in Pakistan, Iraq, and Afghanistan. But there was a law preventing it, preventing any Department of Defense assistance to North Korea. Well, that made me angry. After I retired from the Air Force, I went to work after a brief time in industry at an institution known as the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, where we educated and had workshops with military and civilian leaders from every country in the Indo-Asia Pacific except North Korea and many others. And that's where I really got involved in reconciliation and peacemaking, especially with Vietnam, but also in Myanmar, so it doesn't always work. Nepal kind of works, Sri Lanka, East Timor, and elsewhere. And see both and that allowed me to see both the possibilities, the opportunities, and the challenges. And it convinced me that if you're not thinking you're making peace, you're not making peace. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a bit. So, after leaving APCSS in 2017, this became my thing, my obsession. Specifically Korea, because I'd served there 2 times and served in the Pacific, and because it's a problem that needs solving, but also because US policy has failed so miserably since the end of the Cold War. And there's no other way to put it. We say we're deterring, we say we're going to end their provocations. We have done neither. We tried to forestall their nuclear development. How'd that work out? We lament the deplorable human rights in North Korea, and in fact passed an act of Congress in 2004, I believe, that set forth actions to take to improve human rights in North Korea. And I would submit that we have not improved the human rights or circumstances of a single common North Korean since then. So it's failed. There's another veteran warrior part of me that fuels this passion, which I think is really anger. And that is that of all those who sacrificed, Americans and others of any side, we have not closed the deal. I imagine a US Marine comforting his wounded comrade who's bleeding out in the frozen Chosin in the winter of 1950, assuring him that the sacrifice will be worth it. And it's not yet, because we're not done. And that, as you can probably tell, angers me. So that's the windmill I choose to tilt at, and that's what turned me into a peacemaker. And that's why I do this all the time. But it's not my image that matters. It's the American self-image, the self-image of our government. And I am a proud and patriotic American. I'm not, but this is an area we need to change. Christine talked about deterrence. Okay? Deterrence is conflict prevention. I'd say war prevention, but we are still at war. We see ourselves principally on the Korean Peninsula as preventing a reignition of the war, preventing conflict. Okay, we have to do that. The actions that Christine suggested, some that you'll find elsewhere, I'm not too sure won't be dangerous in terms of backing off, necessary in whatever deterrence is most effective. Again, open to debate on that. But that can't be our principal role. The United States must reimagine its role on the Korean Peninsula as peacemakers. President Trump has said he wants to be a peacemaking president, and I have a way to do it, and now we're going to get to the opportunity. The opportunity is to prove that we are peacemakers by being ready for peace. We're not ready. If Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump had walked out of the Metropole Hotel in Hanoi in 2019 after their last and sadly failed summit and said to the United States government, "We're cool, let's make peace," the United States government collectively would have gone, how? We had a senior official say to us in the White House, in the National Security Council, at one of our proposals, well, how are we supposed to do that? This is your job. You must be ready for it. We are not ready for it. And there are specific actions that can be taken to prepare for peace so when the moment presents itself, we can act instead of stumble and get to another point where some of the perturbations that invariably occur in discussions with North Korea derail the effort. How do we do that? Here's my opportunity proposal. The President of the United States should establish an Office of Korean War Resolution and make the resolution of the Korean War a national priority. Now, this is unilateral. It's necessarily unilateral. But because it's unilateral, we could do it tomorrow. I say it's necessarily unilateral for two reasons. One, it is our job. We signed the armistice agreement. US, North Korea. I'm not excluding South Korea. Eventually, they'll all be involved. But the US, as the commander of United Nations Command, must plan for peace. And there is much planning to do. Okay? That's one reason. It's our job. The second reason is nobody else is going to help right now. That's not an indictment, it's a statement of reality. South Korea is in a major political transition, and if you look at the governments, liberal and conservative, of each of our countries over time, they never line up. We're not going to get these two democracies in perfect synchronization, so that's not going to happen. North Korea won't talk to us about anything, and while there was much made of reunification in the video, they've even walked away from that. North Korea is not going to talk to us without some draw. I travel to China annually, and I work with Chinese active and retired military and civilian leaders as a private citizen, but in consultation with the US government. They have their own interests. They're not going to help at the outset. Russia is going to be Russia, and Japan has its own internal political issues and will tend to focus on a small number, but important number of abductees from North Korea. We have to start this alone, and there's work to do that can be done readily. The first I would call a discovery phase, sort of in legal terms. We need to look at lessons from the Korean experience of crafting the argument, of the armistice and then implementing it, and both success and failure, what has worked and what hasn't in the other policies, the agreed framework of the mid-90s, of the six-party talks that were too big to succeed, of the summits, all the efforts we've taken. There are things to learn that must be learned in the context of how do we apply these lessons to make peace. We should learn from the success of the reconciliation between US and Vietnam, which took nothing but hard work and took decades. There's nothing easy, but there are valuable lessons there. Of the experience of the US association with Northern Ireland, there are things to learn we haven't learned. How do I know we haven't learned this? We haven't learned it. I ordered this book from Amazon. It's the diary of the US Navy Admiral who led the negotiations for the armistice at the outset, Turner Joy. It came to me, believe it or not, from the University College of Wales, former library book that was there for decades. I am certain it was unopened. Not just the University College of Wales, but there are all kinds of things we have not taken the time to learn. So we need to do that. And then we need to set about practical, pragmatic, substantive efforts to prepare for armistice, or for true peace, replacing the armistice. Such as, where's our operational plan for the military side of success? We have plenty of plans for failure. We have all kinds of plans at Indo-Pacific Command to address this or that catastrophe. What about planning for peace? We do not have that. And that would include things like, how do we transition our alliance with South Korea? I don't think we're leaving right away. I don't think we should. How do we transition armistice organizations like the United Nations Command, the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission, or the Military Armistice Committee? How are we going to do that? If we know ahead of time, we'll get to peace much quicker. What do we do about a truth and reconciliation process? We heard half the truth here from a North Korean side. There's another half that has to be shared. The US bombing of North Korea is a particularly difficult thing that we have to talk about. There are other things from the North Korean side that must be talked about as well. We must have a plan to get enough truth that there can be reconciliation. We haven't thought about it. We haven't pursued it. We need to get after that. And then there's the matter of boundaries and borders, which were pivotal in the initial negotiations of the armistice, but need to be addressed as well. And I see there an opportunity, because the land boundary is pretty well settled, but the maritime boundaries are not. And that's because they weren't addressed fully in the armistice. And maritime boundaries have become much more important in an international legal sense. What should we do about that? Now, this is not a Pollyannic thing where I think we're going to do all this US-only work and then issue it to the world. But once we start talking about boundaries, especially maritime boundaries, I am convinced North Korea will start talking to us because of their vested interest and their stated positions on the matter. If we went to them tomorrow and said, let's talk, there'd be a gesture, but it wouldn't be a thumbs up. Okay? If we are serious about pursuing preparation for peace, and it's in matters that they have an interest in, and it's not seen as hostile policy, I'm convinced they'll come to us. Maybe quietly, maybe behind the scenes. So those are all things that can be done tomorrow. So, in closing, the United States must reimagine itself with regard to North Korea and the Korean Peninsula as peacemakers. We have to prevent war, but our purpose is to end the war and promote a lasting peace. And the way to do that is to start with an internal U.S. effort to get serious about peacemaking by establishing an Office of Korean War Resolution. Thank you very much.
I'll just ask both of you to describe how it is that it works between the two of you to work together, your different experiences and perspectives. And it doesn't have to be, you don't have to share any secrets, but what is it like, basically you come from two different worlds.
Go ahead, or I'll start, you, whatever.
It's really effective and strategic. I mean, Dan and I don't agree on a lot of things, but we agree on a lot of things as well, too. And I think the kind of the optics of a peace activist, women's peace activist that kind of did this crazy action with, retired Lieutenant General of the Air Force and the former deputy commander, it is kind of provocative. And so I won't name names, but we were both going to be in Washington, D.C. in 2023, so that kind of places him. But he was the kind of chief Asia czar for the Biden administration. And I sent an email. I got a response really quickly. And so we went to the White House together, and we sat down with the national security person, advisor, and he met with us for an hour. Mm-hmm. And I think it was really helpful to have Dan there for me, because as you can tell, I don't really hold back from speaking truth to power. And I think that something about Dan being there just showed that we are in the service of peace. And he and I may come from totally different perspectives, but we are also both coming from maybe Dan more, I don't even think national security perspective. Yeah. I truly think you're a humanitarian and a universalist. But yeah, there was something that enabled him to listen to the things that I had to say that maybe Dan wouldn't say, that wouldn't have been possible without Dan. So I feel that it's really important to work. I shouldn't just work with women peace activists. I shouldn't just work with people that share my worldview. And I think Dan really pushes me to think outside of the box. And, I think in this administration, he really pushes me to think about, we are here to make peace and to make it happen, so be savvy about it.
All of that, with sort of the reverse credit to you for enabling me, and in the room and the connections that got my article published in New York Times and other things. Before that, I was shouting in the darkness largely. But I think the other part of it, we first met at a lunch in Hawaii. The aloha spirit is absolutely real and absolutely part of it, I think. And our first conversation, I think we're glad it was not recorded, because we both vented our frustration. It was at least R-rated in terms of our frustration with the lack of peace. And we both laid that out first, and then got to the things that we disagreed with. But having that foundation that we always come back to, that never comes between us, never gets in the way of intellectual exchange, I think was key.
Yeah.
Okay, so Christine, you mentioned the desire of South Koreans now, 70-something%, to get nuclear weapons. And North Korea obviously has weapons, maybe as many as 50 to 100 nuclear weapons. Is, in your view, it essential for North Korea to disarm first, or, as some have argued, peace has to happen first?
You go first.
Okay, peace has to happen first. Simply because anyone here, if you were Kim Jong-un, would you unilaterally relinquish nuclear weapons until the conditions are very different? And he said he would. So I think the press for eventual denuclearization can never be cast aside. It would obviate the Treaty on Nuclear Non-Proliferation. It's just a horrible idea. It's not realistic to make that your primary goal. It's simply not realistic. So peace first, without giving up the stated intent to pursue denuclearization. That's my view.
Yeah, I don't think it's that far off from where I stand. The only thing I would add is, there's a very powerful and well-organized disarmament community, and it's been really interesting in the whole era of Fire and Fury I remember, so I was on a call with Plowshares Fund. In the US, they are the largest nuclear disarmament foundation. And so they fund a lot of civil society research, academics. And the president at the time was Joe Cirincione. You may have seen him on TV. He's often a talking show pundit. And I remember it was the Panmunjom summit had happened between North and South Korea. And so they had convened a call with leading nuclear disarmament experts. And I joined the call from Hawaii, and I often feel like I'm the person in the middle of the ocean, in the wide Pacific Ocean. But it was really interesting, the kind of groupthink that can get into place in those circles and communities. But here you had North and South Korea, the leaders, sign an agreement saying that we are going to transform the 70 years of war into a peninsula of peace, and actually make tangible steps towards that end. And then you have this nuclear disarmament community that was saying, just like very much in the weeds about it. And I was like, can I ask a question on this call? And I said, the two sides say they want peace. So peace first and denuclearization later. And it just, so they say they want a peace agreement. So we are the peace, I believe the nuclear disarmament community is the peace community. How are we going to change our approach to reflect that desire of the Korean people? And it just, I have to say, it took a little bit of working, but it was really redeeming for me to finally hear Joe Cirincione be on the talk shows and whatever say, we're not going to get denuclearization unless we get to peace.
Could I add on a little, Neta? This is peace is what will make nuclear conflict far less likely.
Yeah.
Right now.
Yeah.
And I want to say, as I've written in the New York Times, I know nukes. I was a nuclear certified strike pilot for a NATO target as a young lieutenant. I was responsible as a wing commander for the storage of nuclear weapons at an overseas base. I oversaw the ICBM fleet as the vice commander, Air Force Basic Command, and as the deputy commander at Indo-Pacific, at then Pacific Command, and acting commander, I had unique responsibilities in that part of our national security. Nuclear war absolutely is possible with North Korea. Absolutely. They have the missiles, the weapons, and the doctrine. And the doctrine matters even in a totalitarian state. And because we are not talking, a series of misunderstandings and missteps that could lead to an accidental or intentional nuclear exchange is entirely plausible. The first step is an honest pursuit of peace that restarts a dialogue and gets us headed in a different direction. And I think it's as urgent as can be, as any national security matter for the United States.
So hello everybody, I am David Doyle. I am the head of the Department of Politics and International Relations, and I'm all that's standing between all of you and the drinks reception. So I promise to be brief, but this is the part of the evening that slightly resembles an Oscar ceremony. And it's important, I think, to say thanks, because putting an event like this together requires a huge amount of work. And so firstly, I would just like to thank our hosts, the exam schools, for hosting us tonight in such a beautiful venue. And I would also like to thank Rebecca Freeman, who's done a huge amount of work behind the scenes in putting this event together with Joe and her team, Holly and Joby. They have done everything from arranging flights and accommodation for our speakers, ensuring that they got here safely today, ensuring that we are all here for our sound check on time, and I think have managed the entire event seamlessly. So thank you very much. I would also like to extend our thanks as a department to the Senior Proctor and to the Pro-Vice-Chancellor, Professor Lord Tarassenko, for opening the proceedings this evening, and also the BIDEL for joining us today. It is much appreciated, so thank you. This is the university's principal annual guest lecture in the field of international relations, and the first Cyril Foster Lecture took place in 1960, and it's happened every year bar a very brief interregnum during COVID. And the focus of the bequest we received from Cyril Foster was to promote peace. And I think in the department, we are very proud of the success of this lecture series. But this success is really only possible because of the work of colleagues and the incredibly careful thought and intellectual curation that goes into the preparation for this lecture. And so I would like to offer my sincere thanks to my wonderful colleague, Professor Neta Crawford, who is responsible for the organization of this lecture and for arranging for both Christine and Dan to join us here this evening. So thank you, Neta. And of course, this leads me very nicely onto our speakers. And to say thank you from the bottom of our hearts in the department to both Christine and to Dan for joining us this evening. I think it's a testament to the discussion that we probably could have kept going for another half an hour, except clearly exam schools would probably like us to go quite soon. But as Neta said in the beginning, how opposite it is that we have a talk like this tonight. We stand on the precipice of potential war in Kashmir, we have the conflict in the Middle East, we have the war in Ukraine, civil war in Yemen, I could go on. But how opposite it is that we gather here tonight to consider how to end wars and promote peace building. It's 80 years to the day since Victory in Europe Day, but it does seem, at least to me, as a professor of political science, that we have reverted back in time and we have returned once more to the period akin to the 1930s. I don't remember a period in my lifetime when the world has such heightened tension and potential for global conflict. And that's reflected in the fact that the doomsday clock is closer to midnight than it ever has been before. But I think all of this just reinforces the need for the Cyril Foster Lecture and for space like this to discuss the elimination of war and a better understanding of the nations of the world. And Christine and Dan tonight gave us a wonderful perspective on what can be done to help us bring the conflict in Korea to an end. And so, again, thank you, Christine and Dan, for such an interesting, for such a challenging discussion, and for a discussion from quite different perspectives, but also for such a timely discussion. So thank you. So don't worry, I'm nearly done. So finally, my thanks to all of you, to all the audience, for coming today and for participating. For those of you from the university, from those of you from Oxford, from those of you who know Christine and Dan from the past. As I said, I think this speaks to the nature of the Cyril Foster Lecture Series and the necessity for us to discuss and study and help us to understand how we can build peace in an increasingly turbulent world. I particularly like Liz's question as head of department about where the money's going to come from. But to draw this lecture to a close, let me invite you all to join us for some drinks. I think they are this way, Rebecca. So join us all for some drinks at our drink reception. And I hope we can continue those discussions about how we can end wars and how we can promote peace in this increasingly turbulent time. Thank you.